Well, hello, this is your professor again. We're going to be discussing transitioning into Module 5 in this video. And, you know, I know you're having a difficult week getting your first paper submitted. Um, by the time you see this video, you probably have already submitted your paper. So I'll be reviewing papers and getting back to you if I have any questions. Once in a while, unfortunately, some students really don't do a good job, but very few, and I have to return the paper because I don't want to fail students because they didn't understand something or they're not elaborating enough. So you very well may get a paper returned, but it's only to give you an opportunity to make it a little bit better. Um, so I know the class is challenging, okay, for at least some of you. For those, I think, that are really focused on the material, and maybe you're grappling with things, this is difficult for you, and I'm not underscoring that. Okay, I've had conversations with a few of you, and you know their services offered through Rutgers. If you needed some type of support system in dealing with some of the tensions that might exist in your life, or some of the emotions that might be brought up by some of the readings and some of the inquiry here. So, and of course, you're free to call me, um, and we can talk about it, and try to work things through. Um, because ultimately, ethics, I think, should be about not just making our own lives better, which it is important. So there's an element of egoism, right? Self improvement. But to what end? Um, for me, it's to better my family, my friends, my community. That's why I choose to be a public servant. I'm not a federal employee, I'm a public servant. I keep that always in the forefront of my mind because it helps me to avoid the egotistical or self centered approach that, humans tend to have. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But in Module 5, we begin working and understanding how ethics intertwines with human nature and how our moral frameworks are impacted by how we see the world. Now, we're going to be introducing what some of you might call is kooky science, right? Metaphysics. And the first time I heard about metaphysics, I was like, wow, that's a word I never heard before. What do they mean? And it could take different um, ways to explain it. But basically, metaphysics deals with the question of what is reality? Why are we here? What do we do? How do we interrelate with one another? Is there a supreme being? If so, how does that relationship work? And before you kind of dismiss it and say, oh, that's like kind of new age, hokey pokey kind of stuff, maybe I need to be smoking a joint, while I'm, kind of listening to Professor talk about metaphysics. So I get a little buzz going and I'm like kind of really getting it then. Well, I wouldn't necessarily endorse that, but what I would endorse is that you think about this proven by science, quantum physics. If they can get the quantum particles stabilized, they believe they can have the computing power that would combine and be possibly even a multiple of all the combined intelligence in the world. Did you hear me? That's some scary stuff. Now, AI is heading in that direction, right? Some futurists believe within 3 to 5 years, if you build enough data centers, that could happen through AI and not through quantum computing. But that would take a lot of integration, a lot of capital, and to be honest with you, personally, from what I know, which is not a whole lot, I think we're going to lose a lot of jobs doing that. The energy resources required to power these data centers would definitely, probably require us to begin burning wood again in our homes to stay warm, because we got to feed the computers, right? So they can tell us what to do and what to think and how to think and, all that kind of stuff. So this dystopian view um, is a bit of a digression of where I'm going. But in quantum computing, they know the quantum particles are constantly moving, right? And once they, for lack of a more scientific explanation, observe the quantum elements moving under, let's say, a high powered microscope, they stop. Or they move in a different direction. It's as though those quantum particles know they are being watched. That's the first, really weird thing with quantum physics. The other thing they know, they've done this, I believe, as experiments last I read. If you take quantum particles that are kind of like grouped together as a colony and you separate them, you could put them 10 feet apart or 10,000 miles apart. When you observe one and you observe the other, they act in an identical, simultaneous, instantaneous manner and way. Meaning, as you're watching one, and if it stops, the other one's going to stop too. And it's 10,000 miles away. It's amazing. So don't dismiss metaphysics. Don't dismiss the fact that we don't know, really, what we think we know. Okay? We don't know. There might be a new type of math or new type of physics that will be needed to understand the universe because of time, right? Space, distance. There are 4 dimensions, right? We might need a new entire body of algorithms and understanding that people like Einstein and others, like Mr. Hawkins and others, have tried to kind of get a grasp on. So how does this relate to ethics? Well, we want to try to understand the world, and all depending on how we understand it, that kind of impacts our view. So if you look at the world through a metaphysical lens of being just purely biological, you might react with just your biology, your 5 senses, and leave logic out. Or if you view the world and yourself as a being, as a spiritual being, you then, before acting, would seek to connect with your spiritual authority. Okay? Or if you're autonomous, you see the world just as your playground, then you kind of do your own thing, depending on whatever playground you're in that day. And then, if you see yourself as a rationalist in this world, then you're going to kind of be like a philosopher, like a Greek philosopher, kind of studying things, looking and making rational decisions apart from, your spiritual nature or your biological nature or your, autonomous nature. So that's why it's important to understand how metaphysics, how you view the world, impacts your ethical framework. So when you begin reading Boss Chapter 1, just don't say, oh, this is hokey pokey again. Understand it, okay? You're going to look at, and of course, review ethical subjectivism, where basically morality is predicated on feelings. And I had a student contact me about a situation, and it was clearly evident this student was working off of emotion and not being rational. And when you work off of your emotions, you sometimes say and do things that might not be, ideal, right? I do it often, so mea culpa. I have to I have to constrain that Italian hot blood that I have, right? Um, but at least I recognize my bias, and like an alcoholic, I'll tell you I got a problem, and I cope with it. I deal with it. Confession is a good thing. Admission of your faults is a good thing. I'm sure you can all tell me how super great you are, but can you tell me your faults? Are you that introspective? Case in point, there was another student who, you know, mentioned to me that they felt that they were extremely ethical, like kind of like a type A personality, that they were always on top of themselves, and that's good in some ways, being your own taskmaster. But if you are your own taskmaster, do you also know where your weaknesses are? Or how about this? If you tell me your strength, I'll tell you your weakness. Okay? So, and as a matter of fact, we can even maybe, I don't know if we should turn it into an extra credit project or not, but if you email me your strengths and you don't know what your weaknesses are, I guess I should put it to you this way. If you are unsure what your weaknesses are, email me your strengths, and I'll do my best to kind of surmise what your weaknesses are. But hopefully you've all already taken inventory of your pluses and your minuses. Then from ethical subjectivism, right? What I think, what my feelings tell me, you now go to cultural relativism. Again, we talked about it before. It's what the culture says, okay? Well, if I've seen it on a commercial, it must be true, right? If I heard my favorite social influencer say it, it's got to be right. Or if everyone around me is doing it, it's got to be right, you know? Then you move into ethical egoism, and here, you're acting in your own self interest, and there's nothing wrong with that. You have to take care of your body, mind, and spirit, as I would say. Um, the challenge is when you allow your self preservation to take over and maybe harm others because you're too damn important. Your skin is in, not theirs, right? Um, that's the dilemma with being an ethical egoist. Um, Now, we contrast that with Duska, who talks about egoism, and you have two types, or two ways of describing it. Psychological egoism, okay, which is kind of like why we act selfishly, psychologically, right? As a child, you might have been deprived, of certain toys, so now every time you see something really cool, you want to buy it, right? Either for yourself, your kids, or whoever. Psychological, why? Why are we selfish? And that's distinct from what you read early on in Boss, your normative ethics, or normative or ethical egoism, which is the actual practice of how you should act. If you are practicing ethical egoism. Now, understand that ethical egoism as a practice isn't inevitable. You can override that by a moral framework of saying, I have a duty and obligation, as a soldier, as a Marine, as an airman, or a seaman. You put your life at risk for others. So that's an example of you saying, wait, look, I've got to do what I got to do for the benefit of the unit, for the benefit of the mission. So ethical egoism is not determinative. It's not inevitable. You can override it um, through deontology, through empathy, right? You have empathy towards someone, so you maybe risk your life to save someone else's, or just principle, just saying, hey, you know, this is the way it's got to be. It's just fair, you know. And I'll never forget, I had a friend of mine who's gay, and someone asked him, you know, hey, how could you go to the Catholic Church with Dom, knowing their position, you know, on the alternative lifestyle? And what he said in response was, and you could tell he was a principled man, my friend. He said, what does it matter? He said, I know what they believe. I don't have to believe. I don't have to accept their beliefs, but I have to respect their beliefs. And because I like Dom, when Dom invites me to the house for a Sunday dinner, and he also invites me to go to Mass with him, I'll go. I'll kneel. I'll do everything out of respect. And he said, because that's a principle way of living. You should respect others. And he said, the way I know Dom would respect me, and I did, you know, when I was invited to a meeting of all gay men. Actually, they all happened to be gay. It was not a problem. I mean, you know, I respect them, and they respected me. And so this issue of having a principle, right, is important. And one of you, I have to actually thank Anthony White. Anthony, I read your plan exercise, and you talked about the virtues, um, which are important to our behavior. And thank you for that. Excellent. Um, so, you know, even though we are self preserving or we have our biases, whatever, they can be overridden. Now we get into the other part of Module 5, the videos I've selected for you to watch, okay? Now, we'll talk about the videos in a second. I just want to review the midterm exam. Um, on the September 17th, I issued a video that covered this in greater detail, what was going to be on the midterm. But I just want to review it, you know, in case you missed that, and just refer you to that video. But remember, on the exam, you're going to have 7 essay questions dealing with ethical reasoning. That's one. Second essay question, true disclosures. Third, understand and know the Interfaith Declaration. 4, the divine command. Get a good idea from the divine command, and that would be primarily boss. The role of conscience in your moral development. Integrity and competence. Now, integrity will be one essay question, and how that integrity influences your decision making, and the role of competence in being a leader. Okay, so those should be the 7. I just wanted to kind of review those for you. And now we get into the video. The videos in 5, you know, as more comes out about what happened during the pandemic, and with Google's admission, Facebook's admission, X, which was Twitter, they've admitted that the former administration told them to censor opposing views on the vaccine to reduce vaccine hesitancy or help eliminate it. And it's a shame, because if you go to the VAERS report, which is a self-reporting system that hospitals, physicians, and patients can self-report vaccine injuries. We've had this database for many years. There were a lot of possible and some probable serious side effects from the vaccine itself. Now we're finding out more and more. We're finding out from the United Kingdom. Their health services is coming out, and they're being very truthful about how some of the testing done by Pfizer and the others was manipulated, and there was this, drive to censor information. So it's proof. I mean, it's proven. So the first video talks about how California was proposing a law, or maybe even passed a law, that would silence physicians. Think about that. Your doctor can't tell you what they really think. Case in point, my wife has an autoimmune disease. She's disabled. During the vaccine rollout, she goes to see the rheumatologist, and he told us the truth. He said, I'm required by the AMA and the American Association of Rheumatologists, whatever, to tell you that you must be vaxxed. He said, I'm required to. But he said, as your physician, I'm telling you not to. He told my wife straight up, he said, we don't know how the vaccine is going to interact with your markers, with your RNA. And since they had already used chemotherapy to stabilize my wife, the doctor was like, let's not screw with this. Let's not mess around with this. Now, had this California law been in effect here in Virginia where we live, could you imagine he might have lost his license for telling my wife the truth. So think about real terms. Now, whether you were pro-vax or not, you got to admit we were not given all the information. So look at this first video. Now remember, there are two sides to a coin. There were certain groups of people with comorbidities who were extremely prone to COVID. They should have been targeted. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean they should have been focused. Those should have been the people we were immediately looking to help. I won't say any more, but if you go back and you look at the demographics of those people, where they live, their age, etc., you draw your own conclusion as to why the lack of informed decision, especially with your own health care, is a serious problem, and we hope that this never happens again. Our second video, again, deals with a journalist who was censored for questioning, what the cultural relativists were saying. And what was ironic here is that this journalist was of that persuasion in general, labeled as, a progressive or that type, and they expressed an alternative view, and they were being censored in journalism. So the first video talks about, how you're trying to silence doctors. Second video talks about how journalists were censored. And I don't mean, forgive me, they did silence doctors and scientists. Then we go to the third video. And the third video breaks away from, let's say, the COVID pandemic drama. And it gets into something that, those of us who are sports fans or, care about government performance, Brett Favre welfare scandal. And that was weird. And it was weird how he tried to explain his way out of it. Why are these videos important? Well, the first question is, ethical question. Can a government, or should a government, be allowed to censor medical speech? 1. 2, is media suppression or alternative views, questioning institutional norms, ethical? Can we basically tell reporters, shut up, sit down, we don't want to hear you, okay? And this, runs the gamut, right? from our current sitting president doing this to members of Congress and others. When people talk transparency, I have a word picture, but I can't share it with you online. But when people talk transparency, they really don't mean it. Very few people really mean it. I always say here in Washington, D.C., when I came here from Jersey, because we're straight shooters up there, if we don't like you, we tell you, we're up front, but you know what we do? We still respect you, and we're going to work with you. We're very direct that way, right? The New Yorkers and I know folks down south have a different approach, and out west you're really chill, and the Midwest, I think you're probably the best archetypical example of an American, maybe the Midwesterner. So when we think about this issue with Brett Favre, when does personal gain, right, collide with justice? How does that happen? Is there a point when it crosses over and it becomes unethical, or is it a really bright line? When we kind of look at the Brett Favre video, okay? So, some of the themes in Module 5 that I want to close with. Can we tolerate views from everybody? Should we? I think the answer is obvious. If you want to be a critical thinker, you need to. If you want to really examine yourself like you do in an AA meeting, or if you go to confession, or if you're just trying to be brutally honest with yourself or a friend, all the facts have to come out. Otherwise, what type of decision are you making? But again, that's the ethical question. The other one is what about culture? Does culture in and of itself protect us? Or is it a mirror, like Plato says in the Republic, that a government is a reflection of its people? So it goes back to what maybe I ranted about once before. You complain about the government, you complain about your elected politicians. They're not the problem. You are and I am. We elect them. And we can't avoid accountability by saying, well, we never knew they were going to go this way. We didn't think they were going to vote these crazy policies. Well, then you weren't paying attention. Okay? Or you are so inexperienced, or not critically thinking and observing, or asking others who might be older, wiser, more knowledgeable for their opinions. And not just what you want to hear, but from both sides. So, how does culture play? Is it a shield protecting us? Or is it a mirror? And the other point is, when does self-interest become unethical? This ethical egoism that you see in Brett Favre's video, okay? So with that being said, I'm going to remind you, I'll be away for 3 weeks in Italy. I'll probably release some of the modules earlier. So in case there's an internet problem, you won't get stuck. It won't be to make you feel under pressure. I'm going to do my best to stay as current as I can. But if the grades lapse a bit, it's because I'm having a great time with my family, and I'm going to have to get caught up when I get back. But if you have any questions, let me know. The midterm, I think I've given you sufficient information, both in the September 17th video and today's video. So you kind of know really what I'm going to ask. And then that's the thing. Again, for those of you struggling emotionally, maybe, you can call me. Or you go to one of the support centers. I don't want you to struggle in the class. I want you to grow. I'm going to challenge you. And that's why Professor Smith developed I'm telling you, I think it was brilliant what he's done. Yes, is it difficult? Yes, is it hard for the serious students who really want to grow and understand the material? Yeah, it is. But you know what? It pays rewards. Let me tell you something. Don't ever think that you can achieve success just by reading a book or just by watching podcasts. You have to go out and do the work. I don't care what it is. You've got to work hard. If you don't, you reap what you sow. In other words, if you're going to play a mediocre game of football or baseball, that pretty much means that your practices were mediocre. You weren't pushing yourself. And I know it hurts. I know there's growing pain involved. But especially for you younger folks, this is your time. Have a great week.